Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be looking at the state of Virginia, or the Commonwealth of Virginia, as those of you who are longtime viewers of the channel will know. And we'll be focusing in on the gubernatorial election happening here in less than a month. This is going to be the second to last Virginia-specific, or at least for the governor's race video that I'm going to do. I've tried to do these every 2 months, roughly, and I would say not a lot has changed since the last time we looked at Virginia's gubernatorial election specifically. A lot has changed in another statewide election in Virginia that I made a video on a couple days ago. But today we're just going to check back in as we do on this race. It's obviously an important one. Democrats really are going to need to flip this one back, if we're being honest with ourselves, to have momentum and to feel better about the position they're in nationally. And so we're going to get right into it by, I would say, looking at the most consistent indicator of Democratic strength in Virginia, which is the polls. Now, in this race, which is between Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger from the central to northern part of the state and incumbent Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earl Sears, the trend has been pretty clear, at least in public surveys, which is that Spanberger has a lead. Now, whether that lead is by 12, as WAPO had it at the end of September, or whether it's by just 3, as we had Trafalgar saying a couple of days ago, there's some variance, but overall, the trend is clear, and it's that Spanberger does have the advantage going back to August. And what I think is worth noting here, especially now, is that the quality of polls and the intention of the polls that we get are going to vary greatly. So a lot of polls, right, like, for example, university polls or, the big name polls, right, like Christopher Newport University poll, WAPO, Emerson, these are bigger name polls. These polls are, for the most part, going to be pretty objective. That doesn't mean accurate or perfect, but they don't really have as big of a motivation. Whereas Trafalgar, which is a more Republican-leaning pollster, is going to obviously show results that are better for Republicans. And then you have PPP, which is sponsored by the DGA, Democratic organization, that's going to be more favorable to Democrats, and Spanberger as a result. But if we look at nonpartisan polling, right, Christopher Newport, Spanberger's up by 10 here. WAPO has her up by 12. She's up by 10 in Emerson. She's up by only 3 in A2 Insights. She's up by 6 in Coefficient. She was up by 12 in the Christopher Newport survey from earlier in September. And then if we look at the VCU poll, she was up by 9. I'm a big fan of the VCU poll and the Roanoke poll. I want to get more of these before Election Day, but they had her up by 7 in mid-August and then 9 at the end of August. So, it's pretty clear to me that Spanberger does have the advantage in this race. That's what you've been saying for, a while now. And I think what's more interesting to me is why this has happened. And to me, there's no really clear reason. I think that Republicans kind of gave up and jumped ship a little early, right? Obviously, the national environment, this is a big thing we talk about almost every video, I feel like. But the national environment, the consensus and the conventional wisdom is that the party out of power, so in this case, the Democrats, are, they're generally more motivated, they have higher turnout, and they win over more independent voters because a lot of people, and just generally speaking, are not happy with the way things are going. That's why in 2018 and 2014, in 2018, Trump was in office, in 2014, Obama was in office, even though those were not election years held in recessions or like major like crises that would have resulted in huge dissatisfaction with the incumbent party. In both of those years, right, the incumbent party lost a number of seats, and we had huge waves for the other party. Now, 2022 was a bit of an exception to the midterm rule because Democrats, even though they were out of power, they did relatively well in both the Senate and the House, and they actually gained a seat in the Senate, although that was more about the kind of seats that were up, and they only lost a net of 9 seats in the House. But I would argue that 2022 still vindicates the theory and the consensus that the party out of power has a big boost because in 2022, Republicans ran a number of candidates that were seen as unelectable. The Dobbs issue really harmed the GOP down ballot, and they still were able to gain back the House. So despite some really unfortunate circumstances for Republicans kind of in that year specifically, the fact that they were out of power and the fact that Biden was pretty unpopular as a president were really, really helpful for their candidates across the country, and that's why they did win back the House. So as we look ahead to November, which is going to be here before we know it, right, we have to consider that Democrats have a pretty fundamental advantage in the sense that they're out of power and that within Virginia, at least, Donald Trump is not super popular. In all of these polls and all these cross-ups, we see he's underwater. He obviously lost the state to Kamala Harris last year. So it's a blue-leaning state where Trump is more likely than not a drag on the ticket for Republicans. And with him being in the White House, it certainly benefits Democrats in terms of national environment. Now, another thing that I want to touch on, and before we kind of move on from this, is that I don't think that Earl Sears has run a campaign that has been as strong as Spanberger's. And don't get me wrong, I don't think that Spanberger's run a perfect campaign either. Although I do think that her campaign is notably a bit better than Mikey Sherrill's up in New Jersey, if you're comparing Democrat to Democrat. But we've seen big issues for Republicans in Virginia, right? Glenn Youngkin, I think, has been a little bit less visible than Republicans would have liked on behalf of Earl Sears. I thought that Earl Sears, I watched the most of that debate. I didn't think that she had that good of a performance. Obviously, gubernatorial debates are not watched by the majority of voters in the state or in the Commonwealth, if you're being Virginia or Pennsylvania or maybe Kentucky even. But I think you get what I'm saying, right? Like, most voters do not watch gubernatorial debates. But I still think that Spanberger came off a little bit better for the most part. I thought there were a couple moments where Earl Sears kind of took the bait and kind of, made ads for Spanberger, right? Like, I think the term that we often use is kind of clip diving or clip farming, which is that candidates, knowing that most people don't watch the whole debate, they'll try to get a good 15 or 20-second jab in, then post it, hope it goes viral on social media. I thought Spanberger was a bit better at playing that game than Earl Sears was. And so overall, and then one more example I can give that's really interesting is that there was a police union, right, within Virginia that I think actually endorsed Trump in 2024, and I think probably Youngkin in 2021, that endorsed Spanberger this year. So there's been some defections from the Republican side, and I don't think that Earl Sears' campaign has just been run as well as Spanberger's. She's had more turnover too. I think she fired her campaign manager in the summer, which is not usually a sign that you're doing too well in a race. So overall, what I think we're looking at is a race where Democrats just had a big lead. I think they've run a stronger campaign, and the national environment is backing them up pretty well. Now, the question that then becomes, is this going to be a blowout? And first, to answer that question, we have to define blowout. And I would say blowout really, in this case, would be a 12-point victory or more for Spanberger. Harris won the state by 6. She'd be winning by twice as much as Harris did if she were to win by 12, Spanberger. It'd be more than Biden in 2020. Biden won by 10 in 2020, so it'd be a little bit bluer than 2020. Although notably, it would be redder than the 2018 Senate race, which is the best statewide result for Democrats I can think of in a competitive, near top ballot race in the past few decades. I mean, Tim Kaine won by 16% that year. So maybe 16% would be a pretty big blowout. I think anything north of 12 would be probably blowout territory, though. Like, if Sandberg won by 12.5, I'd probably call that a blowout. And then there's also a scenario where maybe she wins by a moderate amount, which is 6 to 12, maybe 6 to 10. 10 to 12 is maybe closer to blowout than it is moderate, but if you get the idea. And then I would be shocked if outright Earl Sears were to win, but even if it's within 3 or 4 points or within 2 points, that would be, to me, a pretty good sign for Republicans, because it would mean that despite the disadvantages they've had in this race, they would be, they're competitive, at least in Virginia. They're outrunning Trump. If they were to only lose by 4, that'd be an improvement from 2024, which was already a good year for Republicans nationally. So that's just, I think what we're looking at in terms of what the margins mean. Now, before I get into my prediction, as we wrap up the video, I do want to talk about something interesting, which is that if you look at Virginia's gubernatorial elections from the past, just 25 years, they've been pretty swingy with regard to the presidency. So in 2000, George Bush beats Al Gore in the presidential race. Mark Warner flips the governorship of Virginia from red to blue. Okay, 2005, Tim Kaine holds it by about 6% over Gary Kilgore. This was a year after John Kerry, the Democrat, lost his bid to unseat George Bush, the Republican incumbent president. But in 2009, Obama has won just a year prior. Republicans win it back. Bob McDonnell wins by 17%. This is certainly a blowout we've got on our hands here. Now, in 2013, this is the exception to the rule. We do see Democrats led by Terry McAuliffe hold on, even though they did win the election the previous year. But a lot of Republicans will tell you that they lost this race because of Robert Sarvis, the Libertarian, who took 6.5% of the vote in the race that was decided by 2.5%. I think there's an argument to be made for both sides, but I do get what Republicans say here. I do think that had you run this race without Sarvis, Ken Cuccinelli probably would have won, although it would have been within a 1.5 either way, based on most estimates I've seen. It's always hard to calculate that kind of thing, but I do think that this race was skewed a little bit by the Libertarian and pulling more from Republican counties than Democratic counties. And then in 2017, if you look at what happened the year prior, Trump was elected president, Republicans win it back, but Democrats hold Virginia, and they expand their margin. McAuliffe won by 2 with the Libertarian on the ballot, 2.5 maybe I should say, and Ralph Northam won by 8. in this year, actually closer to really 9% actually when we look at it. So Virginia got a lot bluer after Trump won, but after Biden won, what happened? Well, this was quite the race. Glenn Youngkin defeated Terry McAuliffe, remember him, by 2%. And so we see that in every year except for 2013, the party that won the presidency went on to lose the election for governor in Virginia within 12 months. So that's a pretty ominous sign for Republicans. And it's one that I think is really worth noting just because overall, when we think about historical trends and what they mean, I often, like people, if you listen to me, you'll know that I really take this to heart. I don't love trends just because they're historical and because they're patterns. I like them because they tell stories. And the story is voters are mad at the party in power. Whoever's in charge gets blamed for the problems of the country for the most part, and that is not good for the party in power that's getting blamed. Now, the one other thing I want to add on before I make my prediction here, and I know I'm being a little, I'm kind of building up some stuff, right? But one more thing I want to say, there's a government shutdown currently going on. Obviously, what we've seen in the limited polling we have is that harms Republicans a bit more than Democrats because they're in power. Okay. But if you were to think of states that were most affected by government shutdowns, by government layoffs, by these programs shutting down temporarily, what would it be? It'd probably be DC's not a state, so we're not counting DC. It would probably be Maryland and, of course, Virginia, especially Northern Virginia, right on the border of Washington, our nation's capital. So when you have that backdrop, a month before the election, a lot of people maybe don't like the chaos or don't like the disruption, and they're going to maybe blame Republicans for it. At least that's what we're getting in limited opinion polling. That would not be anything good for Winsome Earl Sears, who's going to be tied to President Trump as the Republican in this race with Trump in office, kind of the same way that in 2021 Terry McAuliffe was tied to Joe Biden. So what does this all mean? Well, I think right now we're looking at about a 10% margin of victory for Spanberger. Now, I'm open to revising that. I think it could be more. It could also be less. I'm hedging a little bit, and I might change that before November the 4th. But what I think is going to happen is Democrats are going to do fairly well with independent voters, and the Trump effect is going to hurt Republicans here a little bit. It's a bluer state nowadays. He's not super popular there. Having him back in office doesn't do them any favors. The pattern we've seen in these elections he's made that pretty clear. Government shutdown, not good timing for, Republicans in Virginia especially. But I think it's going to be maybe a little closer than a 12 or 13% margin of victory that some are predicting, right? Like the poll we got out of WAPO from the end of last month had a Spanberger plus 12 result. I think it'll be a little bit closer than that just because, and I'm open to revising this again because we're going to wait and see, but I do think that the early vote data shows Republicans are turning out reasonably. One of the big things that I think Democrats had going for them throughout this entire year in these special elections was that they've had really big turnout advantages, right? Like they flipped 2 state Senate districts in Iowa. That in large part came from turnout advantages, not like Trump voters defecting to a huge extent. So I would say Republicans, they're probably not going to be close to winning this race, but they can keep it below 10 or 11% with turnout that is higher than we think, or that is higher than it's been, I would say, this year, because Republicans have really not been doing well in these turnout battles, in these very local special elections. We're going to see how that looks in Virginia come November 2025, which is just going to be in a couple of weeks from now. And I'd say the preliminary data shows that Republicans are holding up just fine thus far. And we're going to keep checking in on that. We're going to keep looking at it. But as of right now, I'd say Spanberger is going to win, probably comfortably, but maybe not by the blowout margin that a lot of people are expecting, just because from what we've seen so far, Republicans have not really bowed out of this race. So let me know what you're thinking. Let me know if you'd like to see any future videos on Virginia's other races. I've already talked about the AG race. I've already talked about the governor's race a couple of times now. We're going to talk about the lieutenant governor race probably once before the election. We'll also do New Jersey as well. So thanks so much for watching. I will see you all in the next video.